let's see, I've been with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We have an office here in Boise, and I've been there about 4 years. Before that, I was with the state of Idaho. What I do, I'm a wolf coordinator for our Region 1, which includes Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. It includes Hawaii, too. We don't have wolves in Hawaii, so actually, I got to go there once. Not for wolf stuff, but so that's my current job. I was with the state of Idaho before as a regional wolf biologist, and I was in the Southwest and Magic Valley, so I covered 2 of the state regions. I guess before that, I did a little consulting work with the state of Utah. It's tough when you're married and you're trying to figure out school and jobs and stuff. So we were in Utah for my husband, and I worked out a deal with the state. My grad work is on mountain lions. Got my master's looking at predator-prey stuff, so mountain lion predation on mule deer and white-tailed deer primarily. And then I did a PhD on mountain lion population demography and specifically impacts of hunting in a couple areas of Washington state. We use different harvest structures and season structures. One area they used hounds, another area they did not. So I was looking at just a whole bunch of demography issues and how effective hunting strategies were in those populations, and it was great. For you guys that are not in grad school, and if you're interested in wildlife, really try and go back and get a master's at least, and look for a good project that's going to be interesting because it's so fun, and you make contacts with state agencies and nonprofits, and it's great. It's great. So you can go the academic route. I thought I was going to go into academics, and I didn't end up doing that. And I'm at an agency now, and I love it. I never thought I would really like some of the policy that we'll get into and management, but I like bringing my science and research background together with management issues and policy stuff, even though we kind of seem a little dry, but it's solving problems. Like you're trying to fit in something like a wolf, the biology behind it, something that ranges widely, creates a lot of human conflicts, and trying to fit that into this policy that was created years and years earlier without wolves in mind. And so it can be frustrating, but it also is an interesting problem to solve, which we haven't yet been able to solve. So that's my background, and a month from today, the movers come. One of the great things about the federal agencies is you can move around a lot. We have offices, the Forest Service, BLM, all this, the Fed agency, the offices all over the place. And we're moving to Anchorage. There's we have a polar bear program up there, and so I'm going to be coordinating the polar bear program. Yeah, yeah. So we're excited. We wanted to try Alaska for a while. I'm not a polar bear biologist, but I want to learn quickly. But all of the policy and management stuff will transfer. As biology you can learn. Somebody asked me that. We have a talk at Wildlife Society, and how do you learn from species? Do you have to be an expert? Not really. With the background in biology, and for me it's carnivores, a lot of the carnivore stuff, and they're controversial carnivores, and that transfers. That's more important than learning the facts and reproductive rates and some of that stuff, because you can read up on that. But yeah, so we're excited for that change. But so Jen asked you to give a kind of background on, or I don't know, a case study for wolves, or for explaining the ESA listing process using wolves as a case study. So I'm trying not to be too dry, but we have to go over some of this basic info on the ESA and the listing process, so you understand that, and then we'll get into more specifics on wolves. So I'll rush through this, but stop me if you have questions. So let me see, I have my copy of the ESA. So this is, our little booklet. And this thing doesn't look like much, but it's 40 pages of text like this. Has 18 sections to it, and so it's complicated. It lays out 3 specific purposes. First, I think a lot of people may not be aware that first, before talking about the species, it tells us that we need to protect and conserve the habitat. Then we're protecting and conserving the species, and then we are mandated to recover. So this was signed into law in 1973 by President Nixon, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and also the National Marine Fisheries Service, that's under NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, whatever it stands for. That agency and mine were responsible for implementing this. So we're mainly going to focus on listing. Like I said, there's 18 sections and there's a lot more than listing involved in this, but we're going to focus on listing. And first, in order for something to be listed under the ESA, it has to be a valid entity. And sounds really simple. You know, valid entity is defined as a species, a subspecies, or a distinct population segment. Doesn't sound very complicated, but it can get that way. For wolves, it is, because you think about species and subspecies, you get into taxonomy, which can be very subjective and has a long history. And the technology is changing and interpretation of that has changed. For wolves, it is still evolving today. Some things are widely recognized among taxonomists and some things are not. So, you know, in the last 3 years, we've had a lot of publications on wolves. Just in North America, scientists disagreeing on this is a subspecies, this is not a subspecies, and that makes it difficult for us because when we list something, when we decide, make a final action to list something or delist it, anybody can sue us, it's subject to litigation. We go to court and we have to have defensible science, it has to be defensible, but when it's being debated right now in the literature, it's not always that easy. So, it sounds simple, but it's not, and we'll get into distinct population segments a little bit later, but that just allows us to say, I just want to list that population there, not the whole species, but just that population. And then, so once you say, I have an entity I want to list, you either list it as endangered, so endangered of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. We'll talk about this in a little bit, or threatened, and so that all that is it's likely to become endangered. And you see this more fuzzy language, like what does that stuff mean? We'll talk about that a little bit too. So I said there were 18 sections. The listing is in this section 4A, 1A. And so the secretary, you know, this is just word for word from here, it's the Secretary of Interior. Fish and Marine Fisheries Service, we're all under the Department of Interior. So the Secretary of Interior is our ultimate boss. So Congress said that the Secretary shall determine whether species is endangered or threatened based on these factors. So there's 5 factors that we consider when we're listing something or delisting something. We do the same thing. 1 is looking at the habitat. 2 is overutilization. So if you're like body parts of species that are for trade or plants, I think this comes into play more with plants if you're selling and collecting permits and things like that. Disease or predation. Regulatory mechanisms, so harvest, primarily, at least for wolves. And then these other categories, which we do climate change and other, you know, for human or for wolves, human attitudes comes in there. For Mexican wolves, it's a low population size. There's only a few of them, and so you have genetic bottlenecks. So this, and then like sage grouse, fire would be under here. You can kind of as a catch-all for everything else that would be specific to whatever you're talking about. So again, we have to go through every single one of these 5. You know, gather all of the best available science and evaluate whether these threats rise to the level of something being listed either threatened or endangered. Okay, so how does that even get started? How do we start that petition, or how do we start that 5 threats factor analysis, or we also call it a status review? We can just decide to do it if we think we need to do it. Most of the time, though, we're petitioned by the public. So you could petition us yourself, a group could petition us, anybody can petition us at any time to list something, a species, subspecies, or a DES. And for instance, I'm helping our Anchorage office with a project on coastal wolves in Alaska and BC. We were petitioned by an animal rights group to list this unit of wolves on the coast of Southeast Alaska and coastal BC. And so it's a big, lengthy process, and got to go through that threats factor. But once we get a petition, we first look at it for 90 days, just really kind of superficially, and say, do we think there's enough information here that maybe we should look into it further? And then we would move, if yes, then we move on to a 12-month status review, where we go through all those threats factors and really say, do a thorough analysis to say, are these threats large enough to warrant listing? And at the end of that, we can say, no, it's not warranted. We didn't really find that any of those threats or compilation of threats are enough to list as threatened or endangered. We can also say, yeah, it's warranted, or listing is warranted, but it's precluded either by budget or some other species that has a higher priority. We always have to rank them to what priority level is this. So that's kind of in a nutshell the process. But a couple more dry slides and then we'll move on, because these are important to the ESA, but specifically to wolves too. I mean, this is, when you list something as endangered or even as threatened, it's very restrictive. For habitat, so for logging any kind of land use, it's restrictive because we're supposed to protect their habitat. And any sort of harm, harass, certainly killing, collecting, selling, really restrictive. So it's nice it includes some special rules that give us some flexibility in certain situations. So when you have something listed as threatened, you can gain some of these special rules, which basically they just allow you to tailor. You have to write specifically, we will allow X, Y, or Z, which normally would be no under the USA. And that's really helpful. For instance, lynx are listed as threatened, and we have some special rules that allow land use, timber harvesting, and some other things that wouldn't be allowed otherwise if they were listed as endangered. So that's really helpful. I think this is pretty interesting too, the similarity of appearance. So if you have a species that looks like, that's not listed and it looks like one that's listed, that will have the same take provisions. We draw a circle and we say over here. For instance, like Florida panther, Puma concolor, it's the same species that we have here, mountain lions, but the only place they're listed is in Florida. And so in this larger area, I can't remember where the boundary is, but it's larger than Florida. Anything that looks like a Florida panther or any mountain lion out here has take provisions associated with it too, because you can't tell. I mean, if you I couldn't tell probably if I was like, so I think that's kind of cool. But this one is what really applies to wolves. And I think in that reading talks a little bit about this. Section 10 also has this provision for experimental populations, which is gives us the ability to reintroduce. So for wolves, we exterminated them in the lower 48, except for Minnesota. We didn't have any wolves here, but we wanted to bring them back. We couldn't do it unless we had this 10J experimental population here. So it's really important. And then it also says that you don't have to deal with habitat, don't have to worry about that. And it gives us the same flexibilities that we have as if it were threatened. So wolves, when they were first listed, they were endangered throughout all of the lower 48. When we brought them down to reintroduce, and I'll talk about it in a minute, they were fully endangered. So normally, only threatened species would have those special provisions for take. But because we designated this as an experimental population, we have the ability to say, we can allow some take. And that is probably the #1 reason for the success for the wolf recovery, because wolves, anything, grizzly bears, anything that comes into conflict with humans, causes problems, creates human attitude problems. And getting past that, allowing us to flexibility to take care of true problems really has let us recover wolves. Gain some enough support of the public to recover in populations. So that's really important. Okay, so just in general with the ESA, interpretation of it is, I guess it's just a really tricky thing that we have to deal with and gets us into trouble a lot, but the Congress wrote this and Nixon signed it in 1973. And I said before, there's a lot of fuzzy language in there, and there's terms that they didn't define. And so when we put a final rule out, again, we go to court. If we're litigated, we go to court and we have to say, yeah, we're interpreting that fuzzy language as X, Y, or Z. And that has to stand up in court. And so, you can see this fuzzy language like, what the heck is foreseeable future? How many years is that? Is that 10? Is that 50, 100, 200? And why? How do you make a case for that? And that might change. Well, it does change for every species, but we have to provide a scientifically defensible reason for that. For instance, I was helping out with the Wolverine listing. We withdrew the listing, did not list Wolverine, but that's very tricky because you get into climate change issues and how far into the future are models accurate? How far into the future can you reasonably predict what's going to happen with that population? So, and then this significant portion of range, we've got significant, like, is that quantitative? Is that 51% or greater? Or is that a qualitative term? And then you have this range. We get into trouble with wolves or a lot of species. People want us to use range as historical range. So we have to consider all of the areas where they once were. But we interpret this as current range. I mean, if you think of wolves where we extirpated them, they were all over the US, but throughout large portions of the US. Do we need to recover them throughout all of those portions where they once were? Is that reasonable or not? And we still battle this in court, and that's tough. Then I mentioned this distinct population segment is important for wolves, a lot of other species too, but we go through it. We've done a lot with wolves. And there is no definition for what that means in here. And so we came up with ours. We put out a policy in 1996 that defined it. And even our own policy has fuzzy language in it. And so we said, well, first, you have to have a population, and that means it has to be breedy individuals there. And then it has to be discrete, which we do interpret as markedly separate from other populations, but no, it's markedly, not kind of separate, a lot separate. And then it has to also be significant from the rest of the taxon. And so we have 4 categories where we could use the significance term, but it's tough. It's tough to, again, you're trying to fit in, science and what's actually happening on the ground with this policy stuff and this law, and it creates problems. So, okay, let's get into some more wolf stuff. So I'm sure you guys know some of this, but again, the early 1900s, we extirpated wolves from the lower 48, poison, trapping, all that stuff. Even in Yellowstone, we were getting bounties for removing wolves. And then in the 60s and the 70s, there were different subspecies of wolves that were listed in the ESA, and there was a similar law previous to the ESA, and this replaced it. In 78, we consolidated those listings into one name listed in the lower 48, Canis lupus, as a species. With the exception of Minnesota at that time, let me show you a map here. At that time of listing, we had no wolves here except for a few coming down from Canada on their own. So we said, let's separate that and treat that as threatened. But the entire rest of the US and Mexico were all one huge listing as fully endangered. So when we list something, well, once we list it, next step is to figure out how we're going to recover it. Remember, we're mandated, that's purpose number 3 of the Act. And so we said, we get a big recovery team, a bunch of different folks at the table. ranchers and nonprofit, a big variety of people. And we figured out where we're gonna focus recovery. We said, okay, we've got wolves coming down here, so we'll look at the Great Lakes. That's one area. Huge chunk of habitat here. And then we had Mexican wolves, a recognized subspecies in New Mexico and Arizona. And so we've said we're gonna recover wolves in those 3 areas, or target recovery there. So focus a little bit more on the Northern Rockies because there's so much stuff with all 3 areas. So in 1980, we put a recovery plan together. We got the team of people together and we said, okay, we're going to, in the northern, NRM stands for Northern Rocky Mountains. We said, we're gonna treat this as one unit, but within that unit, we're gonna have 3 recovery areas because we think about metapopulations and genetic connectivity. And so at that time, 1980, there were a few wolves that had started coming down on their own from Canada. And so we separated this area as a recovery area just because of that and kept it as endangered. And then we said we want to reintroduce Central Idaho, Yellowstone, and we established those as experimental population areas. And so we defined the recovery area boundaries and then we set quantitative goals. For each area, we said recovery equals 100 wolves and 10 breeding pairs. Not quite the same as packs, but very close. And genetic interchange between the 3 populations. So we did that, and then we did an EIS, and we put the final rule out, finally designated them officially in 1994. And the next year, we started reintroducing. So we got wolves from British Columbia and Alberta, brought them down into Central Idaho and Yellowstone, 2 years in a row, and they did great. Whoops. Actually, they recovered quicker than we thought they were going to. So you can see this, you probably can't see the numbers, but here's 1995 when we started reintroducing. Like I said, there were a few wolves coming down on their own before that, but we put some in here, we put some in here, and then they just took off. And we met recovery goals by 2002. And I should say, we have these numerical goals, 100 wolves and 10 breeding pairs, but we also needed those numbers for 3 years in a row. Yeah, so by 2002, we had 663 wolves among the 3 areas. And we attempted to delist. So, but, if you go back to that map, this is still what the listed range looked like. The entire blue area is one connected unit. So we only have recovery now here. So how do you delist this huge thing when you just have wolves recovered here? That's really tricky. And so we've tried it a few times. Different facts. So we said, okay, well, let's use the DPS policy. And this was before I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, but we said, we will designate 3 different DPSs. And then we realized by 2003, we do a little bit more about the taxonomy of wolves to know that we were wrong. We think we were wrong. This southeast part of the state was not historic range of gray wolves, it was historic range of the red wolf, a different species. So we said, that was an error, so we're gonna get rid of that and we'll substitute it with these 3 DPSs. We'll put these first 2 as threatened because we had wolves there. This southwest unit will still merits a fully endangered listing. So we put that final rule out, we're sued immediately. And 2 years later, usually when we're sued, it can take a long time for the court to rule on it. So 2 years later in 2005, The court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, and wolves were relisted due to mostly our interpretation of that term range and significant portion of range. And it's interesting because you'll see each time we lose in court, it's interpretation of our policy, and normally the courts give us kind of wide latitude in interpreting our policy, but apparently we went, it's still tough to get past. It's just this fuzzy language, and rules don't fit it very well. So we're back to that original listing of the whole Bill 48. Yes.
Not to interrupt you, but so I'm a little confused. So they used your language, the agency language about the listing range against you to defend keeping the listing?
They disagreed with how we interpreted it.
Oh.
And we were saying that current range is the same as the significant portion of range. It's just kind of a complex. They disagreed with our interpretation of it. Yeah.
Based on who's, so they sided with the plaintiff.
Yes.
And their interpretation of range.
Right.
Which was.
Or I don't know, I have to go back and read the court listing. I don't know if they agreed with their interpretation, but they thought that we didn't do it totally accurately or correct.
So you didn't sell all of
it. Yeah. So we listed in 25. Back to that big, broad national listing. We tried again in 2008. This time we said, okay, let's just focus on the Northern Rockies, and we defined the DPS. We went through the discreteness and the significance argument, and at that same time, we delisted and put a final rule out. And when I say final rule, every time we make a final action like that, we have to publish it as a rule. It goes in the Federal Register. It's just this register of any final agency action. It's this really boring looking thing, but it has a lot of good information on it. It's many pages of making the case, going all through the 5 factors. We put it out for public comment, and we have to respond to all of those things. So it's like the official record of our decision. So that's what I mean by final agency action. So we defined this, and we said delist, and we were sued immediately. And later that year, the court ruled against us again and said, we did not show that there was adequate genetic connectivity between the 3 populations. We think that there was, but we just didn't do a good enough job explaining in our document. And inadequate regulatory mechanisms in Wyoming specifically. So we have to, if we're delisting a game species like wolves, it will be turned over to the states, and likely there will be hunting and trapping. And so we do a lot of work with the states, helping them develop a management plan that ensures wolves will remain recovered. We can have hunting and trapping, but we want to make sure we don't drop below those recovery goals again. And it has to give adequate assurances that that's not going to happen. And the court found that Wyoming's plan was not adequate. So relisted back again to that big, broad national listing. We tried again the next year. Okay, well, we'll do the DPS the same, except we'll leave Wyoming out. Basically the same argument. And that was fine because Idaho and Montana had good management plans at the time, and lost again. We're sued and lost again because, according to the DPS policy, we cannot use a state boundary to draw that DPS line. And it kind of makes sense because it's supposed to be discrete or markedly separate, and you got wolves running, territories on the border. So sometimes we do things, it's like, what were you thinking? But we're just, we're now to a point where, I think this is what we were thinking, even though I still wasn't with the Fish and Wildlife Service there, but if you look at these numbers of wolves, we were supposed to be at 300 wolves between the 3 states, 30 breeding pairs, and we're at 1,600. And again, wolves and humans don't always get along very well. Wolves cause serious problems, valid problems. Wolves are great on the landscape, but there are problems here and there. And so we had assured the states that we would delist when we get here, hand it over to the states, and you guys can manage it from there. You can hunt, you can trap, as long as you don't drop below these numbers, which is not very difficult. Those are pretty low numbers. And so you can see the problem this gets us into. People are screaming at us, really, really angry with us that we have how many more wolves, how many times more wolves is that than we had said initially we would have. Yeah.
So 300 total, and then you have to deal with each state needs to determine.
No, we divided it, that's a good question. Okay. We eventually went to, 100 for each state. So they didn't have to work it out. But that was all the ultimate basement. We actually asked for a buffer of 150. But in 1 year, if Idaho was below 100 wolves, if they counted 99, automatic relisting. But when you've got this many wolves, it would be very difficult, almost impossible to get the population that level. So, you can see the problem. We've got states angry with us. We've got public hunters, ranchers, really upset at this, and I don't blame them. And so we're trying everything we can to delist wolves. And here is, again, a case where an animal like wolf just doesn't fit the DPS policy very well. And so, how do you deal with that? I mean, we're still trying to figure it out. And finally, and this was one solution, we couldn't get it done through the ESA, and Congress did it. So I don't know if you guys were aware, 4 years ago, Congress in one of their Appropriations Act attached a rider that delisted wolves in Idaho and Montana. Or it directed us actually to reissue that 2009 rule to delist wolves in Idaho and Montana. And it asked us to work with Wyoming to develop an adequate management plan. So on one hand, when we have the numbers that far above the recovery goals and the ESA is not working, that's a bad thing for the ESA. It's not a good thing for wolves. I mean, it's not. And so on one hand, it was a good thing that Congress gave us. It was my personal opinion here. But on the other, it's a little scary that Congress stepped in, because since then, there have been many bills proposed to delist or do different actions. So, go around laws that Congress established a long time ago for protection of species. So it's a tricky thing. Yeah.
So, is there something in the wording of the ESA that provides for Congress to be able to do that? They just executive order kind of thing, they just decided.
Yeah, I mean, they wrote this, so they can write another one. I mean, and they did. They just wrote a lot. They did attach a rider last budget bill for sage-grouse that prevented us from working on any rule until a year or something, for a year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, I mean, they can say whatever they want to, direct us. They can direct us to do whatever we want to, because we have to work for them, basically. Yeah. Which is kind of scary.
And no one can sue them.
Right.
I was gonna say, I was waiting for the litigation too. So
No. No, and we cannot be sued on that specific rule now. So it shields that rule from litigation. Somebody could come and say, make a different case about that, or they could say, they could petition us again to look at Idaho or Montana. So that there's other ways maybe they could do that, but yeah.
They have the power to just.
Yeah.
So
They do.
who's suing you and saying we don't have enough wolves?
It's been different groups. Well, a lot of the same groups each time, but different. It seems like lately, Defenders of Wildlife Conservation or Center for Biological Diversity, there's a number of big nonprofit groups that are getting together and suing us together, like conglomerations of groups. Humane Society has been a big one in the Great Lakes, Western watersheds, a lot of the big, yeah. Not so much with, I think a little with wolves, but
You look at these numbers and you're like, this is a successful
Yeah.
reproduction. And so there's now a need for management because you're way over the goals. And you get, just like with the elk, you're having issues with large amounts of numbers than there should be, right?
yeah, and it's, it's with wolves, grizzly bears, other large carnivores that they really create emotional. And people don't really think straight. And actually, it's something I really like working with, trying to, because you have to I have strong personal feelings, and I consciously, you put those aside because you will not get anywhere unless you're like straight downhill. Here's how it is, here's what's going on the ground. You have to realize wolves are great. I think they're great. I think they should be in the ecosystem, but they cause problems, real problems. And there's Joe Rancher here. I mean, if you can, Joe Rancher, in Mackey, or there's a lot of places that have high depredation problems, and they're real problems. And you can't just wave your arm and say, no, on the greater scheme of things, it's like 1% of livestock that are lost from wolves. And you can make it sound like an insignificant thing, but it's not. It's not to Joe Rancher, and it's a problem. And Joe Rancher can create a problem if he doesn't think you're dealing with it, adequately or right. Elk hunters go to the commission. They have a strong voice, and I think it's better to. I don't know, when the situation, this is a good example where it gets out of control, the wrong direction, and there's a repercussion that maybe is not so good. Like it can happen with the Wildlife Commission, it can happen with Congress, they can do something, they can overstep because you couldn't control the problem in the first place. And yeah, it's a tough thing. I think, try to remind people that Fish and Wildlife Service, our goal is to prevent extinction, remove the threat of extinction, recover the species, remove the threat of extinction. It's not to continue manage, it's not to recover throughout all of its suitable habitat. It's none of those things. We need to remove the threat of extinction and hand management to the states. Our agency is not full of field biologists that are on the ground managing all of these species. I mean, we do that in certain cases, but we're not set up to manage game species long term. That's the job of the states, and they do a great job of it. And so people forget that, and it's by us saying, here's the goal. That's pretty low in this. It's a big area. It's kind of low, but we're not saying there should not be more wolves than that. We're not saying we shouldn't have wolves in more places. We're just saying that's the low bar. They've recovered. Now you guys can decide how many above that you want. And if you want, 1,200, you can have 1,200. But in order, we get out of the deal when we've reached that low level. So, and people, when you get emotional, they forget that. They just think we need more wolves and more wolves. And I think a lot of people don't trust the states, don't want hunting or trapping at all. It's just emotion. And it's not really practicality. Okay, so we're not done yet though, because wolves would be listed in Idaho and Montana, but they were still listed in Wyoming. And so we worked with Wyoming to develop a new management plan, and we delisted in 2012, and we were sued, and they found that management plan was still not good enough. So wolves in Wyoming were relisted last September. We're still listed now, and we're expecting more congressional action. I don't know what's going to happen, but that's kind of what we're expecting. Meanwhile, this whole process has been going on in the Great Lakes. Same attempts to delist. They have more wolves than we do. They've got 4,000 wolves in the Great Lakes. They're doing fine. And they tried to delist several times and were sued. The last time they tried to delist, in 2012, again, and relisted because of our interpretation of the DPS policy, yet again. And this was interesting because what we did, again, we're going back to that, this map. So how do you say we've got this huge listing? We're never going to have wolves everywhere, right? No, we shouldn't. It's not practical. But we have a recovered population here, and how do we carve it out? And so we, in that 2012 rule, we said, we defined that DPS, we drew the boundary, and we delisted it all in the same action. Now, we had done this before in the Northern Rockies, but we were not challenged on that part of the rule, but we were challenged on the part of the rule for the Great Lakes, and we lost. And the court said, you can't do that. If this was what was listed, you have to evaluate the full thing before you delist it. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to carve this and look at that altogether. And there was just an article today in Greenwater, it's some environmental online blog, and they were talking about that any court case on the ESA, whether it's wolves or something else, has implications for every other species. And there's some other species we were petitioning. The petition, I think it's a sturgeon population. They asked us to do the same thing, to designate and delist at the same time. And we were just told that's invalid and you can't do that. So it creates other problems. We're going to appeal that, or solicitors say we're going to appeal it. We don't agree with it. We'll see what happens.
So they want you to designate it first?
And I'll show you, because we're doing it right now, or we did it. They first say, you have to evaluate this whole thing. And basically say, is this valid or not? If it's not valid, then you have to designate this at one time and then delist later on.
Later.
Yeah, they don't give us, they just said, you can't do it at the same time, it has to be some, later on. Then you
But
get
their
some
fuzzy
time.
language doesn't give you a time frame.
No.
Is that why you guys broke it into those three parts?
Well, it was the same idea of we've got to carve this out. And, when we're sued, the litigants pick out specific problems with it. And then the court doesn't go back to the entire rule and nitpick everything. They only go to those few points that they point out. So nobody pointed at this issue before. Even though we had done it, nobody said, that's not right. So no court, we have never had a court ruling on this specific thing. Now we have. And it's a problem, I think it's going to be a problem for grizzly bears. Similarly, grizzly bears were listed real early in the ESA and they're nationwide listing. But I mean, we have 5 recovery areas for grizzly bears. And Yellowstone, we're about to try and delist, but we don't have a DPS defined yet. And so our plan was to do this, draw the boundary and delist at the same time. So our folks, but it's interesting because we've got a bunch of lawyers in there. We don't agree with the court, with the judges. There was 2 judges on that case. We don't agree with it. We might try it again. I don't know. It's interesting. It's all, we'll see. It's in the works. But, so this current isn't actually current. The map's a few years old because it shows that we've recovered these. And biologically, we've recovered them, but they're not delisted. Or at least Wyoming's not delisted and this is not delisted. So we've done one more attempt to delist, to deal with this issue. And in 2013, we put out a proposed rule, we haven't finalized it yet, to deal with it. And we said, at that time, these guys were delisted. And so we said, okay, we've recovered wolves here, we've recovered those there. Here's what we're going to do to try and deal with the rest of the US of the listing. So we put this proposal out to consider whether and to what extent gray wolves should be listed in the contiguous US and Mexico. So we're dealing with that entity that was there. First, we looked at that entity. minus the bright yellow, we said, okay, let's evaluate that. Is it valid? Remember going back to it has to be valid, it has to be species, subspecies, or DPS. And I think earlier I also mentioned that we now know that southeast was a different species of wolves. We also believe that the northeast is a separate species of wolf, the eastern wolf. And so we said, well, that's wrong. Therefore, that current entity, Canis lupus, throughout all of the lower 48, is wrong. So it should be removed from protection. And then we say, okay, well, if that's wrong, let's see, are there any other valid entities? So we went through the species, Canis lupus. Wolves we've got hundreds of thousands of gray wolves in Europe, Canada, Alaska. So they don't warrant protection as a species. Then we looked at subspecies. So remember I said this one's a tricky one? We had a review of taxonomy conducted for the Fish and Wildlife Service to help us with this. How many and which subspecies should we recognize in the lower 48? And we think the review came and we went along with the review that said there were 3 valid subspecies in the lower 48 in Mexico. Mexican wolf is really, there's only one that's a solid, sure thing Mexican wolf. Well, we recognize 2 others. And we said the 2 others go into Canada, and we've got tens of thousands of those. So we said those 2 subspecies are doing just fine. Mexican wolf, not doing so fine. We'll keep protections for the Mexican wolf. There's about 78 in the wild right now. It's a captive breeding program, and they're having trouble. But the others is tens of thousands if you include Canada, Alaska. And then, so we hit the subspecies, and then we looked around for DPSs. Remember, a DPS, you have to have a population there. You can't just go to like the Plain States and say, okay, let's look for DPS here. There's no wolves there. You have to have a breeding population. The only place there is just west of the Northern Rocky Mountain boundary. And we went through the definition. Remember, it has to be discrete or markedly separate. And we found that it is not markedly separate. If you zoom in, I'll show you a map in a little bit of what's going on in Washington right now. Wolves, I'll show you. Oh, it's right there. This boundary is that Northern Rocky Mountain distinct population segment. And we've got wolves really close. We said that was not separate enough, not discrete enough. And so it's not valid. And so we put a proposal out to delist everything else except the Mexican wolf in its endangered status. And when we do that, we send it out for public review and peer review. And we had a number of issues with our peer review, disagreeing with our taxonomy. And so that's, we still, it's been 2.5 years and it's still kind of tabled. We're not quite sure how to handle it. Because it's being debated in the literature right now. And meanwhile, we've got wolves over here are fully endangered and down into, Oregon and California. And Washington State is extremely concerned about the future, the near future. Conflicts, there's livestock around here. We did have a depredation last year. There will be more, there will be more wolves, there will be more issues, and we don't have the flexibilities of those special rules because these are fully endangered. It's not the experimental population. And so, yeah, that's a problem. I mean, we can probably relocate wolves, but really nipping the problem in the bud and trying to deal with public attitudes when we can't manage, when we don't have any flexibility, it's a problem. So we are just trying to decide what to do. And I think, our office or our agency is really large. There's a lot of discussions that go on in DC, and wolves are controversial enough that the Secretary of Interior gets involved in the discussions. And so, talks are ongoing, we'll see. But it's an interesting issue, and we follow the listing process, but it's not real smooth all the time. So, I just thought this might be interesting for you. We just finally got the count for the Northern Rockies. We do a winter count and put it out in March of every year. And so, yeah, this is by state. So it doesn't include Washington and Oregon, but okay, I don't know what's the total numbers. We have, yeah, so this year we counted 1,600 wolves plus wolves in the Northern Rockies, 3 states, 770 wolves in Idaho, 104 packs and 26 breeding pairs in Idaho. And you can just see, wolves are so resilient. We've recovery there, and they've just gone off like a shot, and with large amounts of mortality. Last year we had 706 wolves killed due to human-caused mortality, and we still had a population increase. So again, back to the thought of people suing us just because they don't want wolves listed or don't want them delisted, don't trust states. We've had hunting seasons in Idaho and Montana for 4 years now, and we moved a lot of wolves, and we still see growth. I mean, we had a few 3 years of decline, and we've had growth this year. So states can do an adequate job, and I think we should let them and see how it goes, because if they drop below those recovery goals at any time, we'll relist. We can be petitioned to relist and evaluate the population again, but we need flexibility in managing, or else it's just not good for the species to have them stay on the list and have this mounting pressure and we're at, negative attitudes grow and grow and grow. It's not good for the conservation of the species. Yeah, so I guess that's all I had. I'll take any questions. Yeah.
So one of the biggest things that I'm mostly confused about in the wording of listing the wolves, you have your recovery numbers at 333 packs, and then so when you try to delist, and you said it was the genetic flow that was holding that up between 3 states.
Yeah.
So in your wording for being recovered, is that like a bunch of check boxes that they have to have 300 breeding pairs or 300 wolves, but then you also have to have this,
Yeah.
this?
That's a good question. It is a little confusing. Those goals that's kind of our definition of recovery for that species, but we still have to go through the threats factors. Anytime we delist, we have to go look at the habitat, disease, predation, regulatory mechanisms in that other category, which includes genetic connectivity for wolves and human attitudes. And so even if you meet those numerical numbers, but you still, if you pick up any threats in those, listing still may be warranted. So it doesn't mean that, hitting those check boxes, you're good to go. It's not necessarily. And you have to run it through policies adequately too, and that's where we failed or were challenged and lost. Each time a little bit different. And it's interesting, in most of those court cases, if you read the opinion, the judge says, especially the Wyoming one of the Great Lakes, the last one, obviously wolves have recovered in the Great Lakes. We've got 4,000 of them there. We've got well above the recovery goals in Wyoming. So they're not arguing that. It's this technical stuff in our interpretation of policy, which can be really frustrating because it's not a biology issue. Yeah.
So you brought up the fact that rangers lose cows and go upset, yet I fail to see what the difference is between them and a businessman who loses his semi because the driver crashes it and has to stomach the loss, and these guys don't? What's the deal with that? Isn't that the cost of doing business?
Well,
Can we shut that off?
no, it's okay. It's a valid point. I mean, you could say that about a lot of industries, technology, digital cameras, businesses go out of business just because times have changed. But I think the agriculture industry is a little bit different, and there's a lot of political power in that industry. A lot. Yeah. But, yeah.
I'm curious who's the jury and judge, of these cases?
It changes. Let's see. Usually it's, I'm trying to remember these last ones. I think one was, they're mostly district courts in different areas. So we'll get DC, we'll get of Wyoming. It's not necessarily a district court that's in the area of the population at issue. So it changes. It changes. There was one district court of Vermont for one of the listings, it changes. And I don't know how they assign that. I don't know how that happens. But there's no jury, it's just a judge.
Yeah, a judge reads it all, looks at it all and says,
Yeah, and I
"This is
mean,
my opinion."
right. Yeah, and it's this long document. I mean, our attorneys make our case and the litigants make their case and then they deliberate and it takes a long time usually. Then they write an opinion.
Right. Wow. So equally challenging then, the same process, right? Keeps something that should maybe be listed off. You guys are not able to take something that shouldn't be listed, right? Take it off. So like in both ways, there's this barrier of.
Yeah, and there is an increasing trend of litigation on most things we try to do. Not just rules, not just controversial species, but pretty much most of the time we do something with a final action out there, we're going to be sued. And it seems like whether we go right or left, we'll be sued. Whether we list or not, one side's going to sue us or the other side's going to sue us. And it's really unfortunate because, I mean, I believe in that we need that process, but it's a ton of money, it's a ton of staff resources, and we're back to ground zero then most of the time. So like a lot of these cases, the judge will say, they'll vacate the rule and say, basically they crumple it up and throw it in the trash can, and then they'll remand it back to us and say, start from scratch. Not just do this part over, do the entire thing over. And that's a year process to issue a proposal. Then you wait a year, you put it out for peer review, for public review, you do a bunch of tour around, do public meetings, and then you do a final rule. And so it's tough to get stuff done. It's really tough to get anything done, unfortunately. And people are wondering if Congress is going to do it.
Because they get so much done.
Yeah, right. Well, we were actually expecting the Great Lakes and Wyoming, there was a proposal for another rider, probably two separate, well, I don't know if it would be two separate proposals or riders, or they would be linked together, but to delist Wyoming and Great Lakes, and nothing's happened yet. But then people think also, maybe they'll just take care of the whole thing, delist wolves everywhere. I mean, they could do whatever they want. Washington is very loud because they're worried about, again, flexibility as the wolf population grows and they're fully endangered. And there was just, they're not on the west side yet, not any pack identified or collared, but just Monday morning, one was hit on the highway on the west side. So that was the first indication that, I mean, not Seattle, but 20 miles from Seattle or 30 miles from Seattle. So, yeah, I mean, and you think, okay, we've got wolves north in Canada, they can come right across the border. We got wolves in Idaho, they can come that way. Wolves are long distance dispersers, they're really resilient. Of course, you're going to have wolves coming down Cascades. It's a beautiful habitat. It's not unexpected, but it makes them really nervous, and they are putting pressure on our agency and Congress to do something about it. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know. Questions. So for the DPS, it seems like that's one of the loopholes is that their litigation is being brought because you're trying to do the DPS and the DPS at the same time. So if you do a DPS and you know, sketch out a range, can there be litigation brought for that?
Yeah, because it has to, you know, we define it in our policy that says has to be discrete and significant. And that significance argument, we've been working on it in this, the coastal wolf in Alaska. It's been interesting to figure out. It's an interesting system out there. There's all these islands and wolves inhabit islands right on southeast Alaska. And there is some genetic differentiation. So first is a lack of data, but we do have data in some areas. And it shows that there is genetic differentiation, specifically on one island that we have a lot of data for. But is that significant? It's been this interesting discussion with geneticists and taxonomists and biologists and policy people. I mean, you would expect that if they're on an island, but it's not that far. I mean, wolves can cross from the mainland to the island. It's not totally isolated. So, you know, you have to go back to what's the intent of the ESA, or what was the intent of the DPS policy? It's just because it's different? Well, you could say anything's different, really, but it has to matter. Like, does it have some adaptation that makes it able to exist there, where if you put a wolf from Idaho on that island, it couldn't adapt quick enough? You know, it's this longer term evolutionary. And so it's discussions like that, where it's not, we have to make a case, we have to decide and make a case and make it all track together, be consistent and defensible, which is, it's kind of cool. I mean, when you start getting all these people, and it's kind of, I don't know, they're interesting questions, but it doesn't make it easy to get everything done.
So your
So
best,
that's the problem.
your case, right, comes from then, like, the evidence is peer-reviewed data, or is it agency data? Of, like,
Oh, we-
pull those things out of the file, or does it?
Yeah,
have to
we're
be
charged to
peer-reviewed?
use best available scientific information. So we, you know, we
What
use,
is that?
what's that?
Yeah, what is that?
Anything and everything we can get our hands on, mostly peer reviewed. If we don't have peer reviewed, you know, you can put some circumstantial evidence in there, but if it's going to court, the best thing is peer reviewed. But for instance, this Alaska thing, there was a PVA analysis done on wolves like in '96, and we had data to update that, or the state had data, radio collar data to update that. And so we just did a new PVA to update it. So we can do our own analyses, or we can ask somebody else to do it. It's not going to be peer reviewed in the time that we have to do it, but we're going to do, you know, send it out for review on our own, but it's not going to be published by then. So, yeah, I mean, peer reviewed is top, you know, gold star, but we have to make a case anyway. We can't just say, well, we don't really know. We have to make a case, and then somebody could say, that's not good. Your data's fodder, that's not good enough.
Where do you feel like the terminology or the tone in peer review papers might actually work to your disadvantage, where we can't come out and say this proves this, or this is better, this is not, like this suggests?
Yeah.
In litigation, do those, again, kind of the wishy-washy language come up as, well, the science is not exact?
Yeah, and it's, when I was helping with the Wolverine listing decision, I just came in on the end of this, and I don't know if you guys knew much about it. We had proposed to list Wolverine as threatening throughout their range due to climate change, because they rely on spring snowpack for denning. We decided to withdraw that rule in this year because of uncertainty, basically. And so, you know, we're trying to, you're using models that are models and they're projecting way out into the future and trying to figure out, well, you know, you basically just have to take what's available and make a case for it and hope it's a strong case and then go with it. And we've, it's hard because published papers, I mean, authors have, some of them have an agenda. And just because, what's that?
No, that's not
No, this is- But we're charged with trying to, put that aside and just look at the data, bring all of these other pieces of data together with our policy and make a call on it. And if we're not doing that, we're gonna get called on it. So it's in our best interest just to, I don't know, we have to make a call. That's the hard part. It's like we can't say, well, we don't know, which we can do as an
And it
office.
kind of doesn't matter what call you make, 'cause you're gonna get sued no matter what.
Yeah, pretty much, we're sued on Wolverine. Yeah, we're still in that, yeah. But, I mean, our goal is do what's best for the species, do what's best for the species. And, at the end of the day, we're gonna get sued, but we still wanna make sure that what we're proposing or, suggesting is gonna do what's best for the species, even if the court overrules us. So, it's just hard then, because it's not just biology, it's like, wolves are doing fine, that's not, what really matters on whether we can actually get anything done is the policy, and whether we can make the biology fit in with the policy, that's the bar, so.
Speaking of bar, segue.
Yeah.
Let's thank Hillary and continue discussions.
That was a fantastic segue.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah, so-